Very pleased today to be here with Ian Lumley. Ian, you're very welcome. Ian, could you introduce yourself to the audience?
Well, I work with Taisce, the National Trust for Ireland, which originated as part of the National Trust movement in the late 19th century, when Ireland and Britain were part of the United Kingdom, and you had inspirational figures like John Ruskin, William Morris, concerned about industrialisation, the impact on the countryside, on historic buildings, and were among the greatest writers of the time, and inspired what has become an international movement to protect wilderness spaces, areas of ecological importance, and the historic environment. And since then, the National Trust movement has very much merged with the global environmental movement, with the overriding concern for climate and sustainable resource consumption. And we work internationally now at all levels across the world.
And what's your position within Taisce?
Well, I would have a strategic advisory a position, but more directly on a day-to-day basis would be involved in monitoring planning applications and infrastructural projects, because we are the only non-government organisation in Ireland which has a formal consultation role in the planning process. That simply means that these applications get sent to us, so it would be irresponsible if we didn't take an informed view on those. And there is a provision in the Irish planning system that for decisions made at local level, that appeals can be taken to a national planning appeal body called Pleanala. And over the boom years now, we've taken 3,000 appeals to the board.
In what years, Ian?
Between the mid-90s and up to now. And that's been quite startling, because it's shown that nearly 90% of those appeals have resulted in the original local decision being overturned or significantly varied. And the reason for that is because the local council ignored its own development plan, ignored national ministerial guidelines, say on spatial planning, and most importantly in recent years has been ignoring European directives, principally the Habitats Directive and the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive.
Yeah, I want to explore that a lot further, because I think that's obviously an issue of major concern. And I must say, since I started following the planning issues in Ireland, I think you sometimes seem like the lone voice in the wilderness on some of these planning issues, as well as Frank MacDonald covering the Irish Times. When did Taisce become involved in the planning process?
The organisation was re-established in 1948 as an independent national trust, and then in the 1963 Planning Act we got this consultative function, and right away we became involved, and very controversially involved, because urban development and one-off housing sprawl was really taking off in the 1960s as car-based mobility. An American influence really took force in Ireland, and you had around Galway Bay, around some of our most scenic lakeshore areas like Lough Gill, written about by Yeats outside Sligo, where you had this middle class flight to the one-off car-based house in the countryside, ghettoising the urban areas for local authority housing estates. And we were at the forefront of that argument, and since then we have been relentlessly attacked by vested interests.
And when did you join Taisce?
I became involved through a school project. That's a very important part of Taisce's work. Schools, education, competition, and other schemes. So it was European Architectural Heritage Year in 1975, where I did a project on the medieval city of Waterford, where I grew up. And after that I took on a voluntary campaigning involvement in the organisation. And in those days the issues were car-based planning, knocking roads through medieval or urban centres. Those are the sort of issues I was involved in those days.
And it's still going on to
yes.
some extent. Now, besides, so Taisce has a statutory basis for its participation within the planning process.
Indeed, very much so.
And you have the right, as a matter of a right to appeal to An Bord Pleanala.
Well, that's the right that any third party, any developer or individual citizen has also. It's just that we are the only non-government organisation that would be exercising that role on a large scale,
Yeah.
simply because the planning system accommodates that, because the applications are referred to us to start with.
Okay. And now who else is involved in the planning process besides Taisce and Board Pleanala?
Well, this is what's so depressing, that you have, in theory, a watchdog situation in place, that there's a number of other state and public bodies. There is, in the Greater Dublin area, there was function specifically given to the Dublin Transport Office and to the Regional Planning Authority for the Greater Dublin area on issues affecting strategic planning, to ensure that that the plans were complied with, that new development would be located that was meant to be on public transport corridors and be public transport accessible. And the reality is that those bodies completely neglected their function. And the comparison that we are now making, we're finding this very difficult to communicate. The country, at least the political establishment, the public at large, has woken up to the fact that we have had very lax financial regulation that isn't peculiarly Irish. We know that's happened across the world, and we know that it hasn't been accidental. It's been very deliberate from people like Alan Greenspan of the Federal Reserve down across the world. There has been a deliberate policy of having lax financial regulation in order to accommodate the growth of the expansion of credit, the internationalization, commoditization of credit to lead the consumer and construction-led growth economy. And Ireland was an extreme example of that, and that is now why Ireland has on a per capita debt basis, the biggest property crash in Europe. And we had a grandstand seat in watching all of that, but equally we've had lax planning and environmental regulation, which has been deliberate. Vested interests have had a very effective lobbying role in ensuring that we had lax regulation, that the individual interest would always prevail over the public interest, whether that be the one-off house developers with their strip development along the coast or lakeshore areas, or big developers doing business parks or housing estates in urban fringe areas. We're given a very lax time and allowed to do what they want, and we're now left with a legacy of over-zoning, overdevelopment, out-of-town retail malls undermining town centres, and this very Irish thing we're now hearing about, these ghost, incompleted, only partially occupied housing estates through this overcapacity.
Now, the local authorities are obviously the main controlling body in terms of who gets planning permission. Is your experience with local authorities that it varies across the counties? Or is it fairly consistent?
We would only say that it's hard to single out any local authority that we could give credit to. To some degree, in the Greater Dublin area, there has been good strategic planning initiatives by a number of the local authorities. But nationally, the local authorities in the counties surrounding Dublin and the Western Seaboard counties really stand out for bad planning, and that's because, or the local authorities around major urban centres like Limerick or Waterford have, through their own lack of coordination with each other, actually undermined the functional status of their own main urban centres by competing against each other for rates revenue.
There are local associations within Taisce, right? And what's their role within the planning process?
Well, very much so. Taisce is a membership-based organisation, and when there is a local association of sufficient strength to be involved in the planning process at local level, then we support and encourage that. And they are active mainly in the larger urban centres, where there's a critical mass of membership and people with an activist concern. It's more difficult in rural counties, and particularly, as has happened over the years, people run into intimidation, where you find quarry operators, one-off house builders, people involved in massed development can be very tough and aggressive in fighting their corner and quite intimidating. So there's been a lot of problems over the years.